Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name is Joe. I'm your host for this week, and as always, I'm joined by my college friend Mark. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Mark, in another sign of the timeliness of this podcast, I've seen some updates on a subject we covered quite recently. The results of cord cutting are playing out in the sports world in a way that we kind of anticipated in our recent episode on that, which is episode 66, if you're paying attention. The Diamond Sports Group, the RSN that was the center of our discussion, failed to make a payment this week, and Major League Baseball took over the broadcast rights to the San Diego Padres. Did you notice that?
I did notice that. I also read that Diamond Sports on some grounds is leveling a lawsuit against the team. Like, we are both not going to pay you and we're also going to take you to court.
Yes.
But I would imagine this would kick off what you talked about in that episode, which is possibly a brave new world for baseball media management.
Yes, baseball was ready for this. They've taken over. They're making the games available for free for a few days, and then it's going to be available in market for $19.99 a month to the fans. They're keeping the TV crew and the radio crew, and it's basically moving to streaming from broadcast. And I find that very, very interesting, given that the Diamond Sports is in trouble with a bunch of other franchises. I think it's the Reds, the Rangers, the Diamondbacks, and the Guardians, and they may soon be controlled by Major League Baseball as well. So right. We are entering the brave new world of post-cord cutting baseball sports economics, as we anticipated.
Yeah. Breathlessly standing by to see if this is disaster or salvation for those teams. We'll see how it goes.
Yep. Okay, but on to current affairs. The question I have for you this time, I know you like your phone, Mark, and you know that I deeply resent being forced to own a phone.
Yes.
So my question was really about the ubiquity of smartphones in this day and age. And I just want everybody to understand, we are not here to debate the positive and negative effects of mobile phones in this episode. We're here to discuss whether they've become required equipment for membership in society. You know, as the question I put to you last time put it, I want to know whether you think it will someday be impossible to be a citizen, a functioning member of society, without possessing a smartphone. So what do you say?
Well, as I say at the top of every episode, thank you, Joe, for the question. But I will say that this was not an easy one to answer. In most of our episodes, there's a body of knowledge somewhere out there, and my task is to simply collect it, make sense of it, and then report back what I've learned. In this case, though, almost everything is speculative. What I'm about to share is not so much a report as the most reasonable guess I was able to come up with based on the evidence I was able to uncover. Still, I hope it serves to answer your question.
Okay, I look forward to it.
And your question calls attention to something that has changed dramatically over the last couple of decades that we kind of take for granted because it's become so pervasive. Joe, you and I are old enough to remember when only a few people had mobile phones. The first cell phones were as big as a brick. You could
Yes.
get a satellite phone that you had to carry around in a custom briefcase.
Yes.
It's kind of wild to remember those days.
Yeah, I sure do remember that. And when people see videos of that today, they often break out in laughter.
Yeah.
That people will carry something like that with them.
The iPhone came out in 2007. And when it was announced, it would really have been impossible to predict how big the effect of the smartphone has been. There were Windows phones before then that ran apps. And of course, the BlackBerry had its heyday before the iPhone was ever a thing. But that was mostly for a business market. Ordinary people like you and me didn't really have much use for those phones. The iPhone and the Android phones that copied it changed everything. The iPhone's become Apple's most important product by far, and profits from sales of that device have made Apple the most valuable company in the world. And we now live in a world in which nearly everyone you see has a powerful computer in their pocket.
I want to ask a dumb question, Mark.
Sure.
Should we be making distinctions between smartphones and other types of mobile phones here? In your answer, Mark, are you talking about phones that are computers and not just communication devices? Because there are flip phones and other primitive cell phones that will take calls and do texts, but don't have access to the internet and apps. Yeah. So let's define terms. What are you talking about here?
In popular parlance, I'm talking about iPhones or Android devices. So those would be the smartphones that run apps. They have app stores. You can download them. You can get your music on there. You can watch movies on there. They are basically computers in your pocket.
Okay.
Because those are the ones that have become just so pervasive and are having this big effect in society.
Okay, good. That's what I thought, but I just wanted to make sure so there's no confusion for me and for our listeners.
Mm-hmm. So a variety of factors have driven smartphone penetration to around 85% in the United States, which leaves about 1 person in 7 who has not yet taken the plunge. And our question today is whether that remaining 15% of Americans will continue to have that choice indefinitely, or if they will be forced to cross over to the other side.
Yes.
And to get us started on the question of whether smartphone ownership will become effectively mandatory, I thought we should start with a quick question of what activities in our lives are mandatory. And then we can look at how likely it is that smartphones will become the only way to perform one or more of those activities. So I gave it some thought and came up with the following short list.
Okay.
First, every adult American needs to be able to manage their money and pay for goods and services. Second, you need to be able to travel, to drive a car, board a plane, and pass through customs. Third, you need to be able to communicate with friends, loved ones, coworkers, and other people in your life. Fourth, you need to be able to work, perform the duties of your profession, and earn a salary. And fifth, winding through many of these examples, you need to be able to establish your identity, which is to say, flash your ID to get into a bar or to vote, or to board a plane, or do the other things that require you to say that you are who you say you are. So how does that list sound? Do you see anything missing?
That's a pretty good list, but the first thing I thought of when you said frame the topic is we all need to eat.
When I was working on this, I did start with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where you have the biological functions. But then I think we can agree that smartphones would not do the eating for you. So I abstracted from there to being able to buy food. And so it was more a matter of, can you pay for the food that you eat?
Yes. Okay. Good point. And I'm fine with that. I just would like to point out that one of the places I got tripped up before I had to buy a cell phone was in restaurants that no longer publish paper menus and force you to scan a QR code in order to see what you're going to eat.
Yeah. Actually, that's a question. In Seattle, we also have the QR codes, but you can always get a paper menu if you ask for one. Are there New York restaurants that simply refuse to show you a menu?
No, I think they will pull it out.
But you have to ask.
Grudgingly if you ask them,
right.
But you have to ask. Yeah, in many of them. That's where we're moving toward.
Yeah. I am married to a woman who is firmly determined to ask for a paper menu every time we're in a restaurant.
Yeah.
Okay, with that list as a basis, we can ask a follow-up question. How likely is it to become difficult or even impossible to perform one or more of these functions without a smartphone? And let's start by quickly crossing out those activities that are very unlikely to be replaced by phones, at least anytime soon. First off, under the heading of doing your job is the notion that in the future, everyone will have a smartphone, and that's all the computer you'll ever need. In this scenario, you need a smartphone to do the things that you currently do on a computer. And I have heard this as a prediction from techno-optimists, but it doesn't hold a lot of water. About 1/3 of American adults today do own a smartphone, but not a computer. But there's no sign that this is becoming the mainstream choice that would influence a market, or that personal computers are going away anytime soon for any other reason. A computer will always be more powerful than a smartphone simply because of physics. It can be bigger with more memory and faster chips, and it can run a lot hotter than a phone, which means you can do more on a computer than on a phone. Smartphones aren't taking over this market anytime soon.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. And I think there's only even a question about work because of what happened during the pandemic and everybody working remotely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Otherwise, we wouldn't even be discussing this, I don't think, right now.
Right. The second unlikely scenario of mandatory smartphone ownership is in mobile payments. Lots of people use their phone today to make payments in stores. I do this myself. I have an Apple Card, and the card number is stored on my phone. I do have a physical card, but the account number is not recorded on the card itself. You can only get at the number on my phone. I like this arrangement. I use it often. I do, however, still have other credit cards because I still need them, and I still carry cash for those rare occasions when I need that sort of thing. The use of cash is declining. Generally, it goes down about 2% every year in the United States. Use of cash dropped sharply during the pandemic because we were all afraid of catching COVID from things that other people had touched, but then it rebounded in 2021. 3/4 of Americans still use cash regularly, though. And the more impoverished you are, the more likely you are to rely on cash transactions. So we're not anywhere close to getting rid of our dollar bills. Within our lifetimes, at least, it is very unlikely that you will need a smartphone to make a purchase.
That sounds right to me.
These are additive activities, things you can do with your phone that you can also do in other ways. For instance, navigation. You can use your phone to figure out how to drive to your destination, or you can use a physical map. As long as those alternatives exist, and maps don't seem to be going anywhere, a smartphone feature might be useful, but it is not quite mandatory. We don't encounter possibly mandatory scenarios until we look at activities that could be completely taken over by smartphones. And the first example here is right in the smartphone's name, its use as a phone. In 2004, 90% of Americans had a landline. By 2020, that number had dropped to 36.7%. In our household, we got rid of our landline about 5 years ago. I know you still have a landline, Joe. Have you given any thought to disconnecting it?
No, I have not. I was forced to have a cell phone, and I don't want to use it for regular communication. I want to continue to use my landline. So yeah, I keep that alive in the hope that I won't be forced to conduct all my conversations on a cell phone.
I think my scenario is probably pretty close to the American average. We noticed at one point that the only thing we were using our landline for was to receive telemarketing calls.
Yeah.
And so we disconnected it simply because it was a regular recurring monthly expense without a lot of value attached to it. And I do know people say you want a landline in case of natural emergency that knocks out the cell towers, but that was not a likely enough prospect to keep us paying for something that we didn't use.
Right.
But I do understand. Anyway, installation and maintenance of those phone wires cost money. The telecoms wanted to get out from under that obligation to their customers and transfer all their business to cell phones and radio signals. And so they put their lobbyists on that. And as of August of last year, the FCC no longer requires U.S. telecom companies to provide landline service. Now, this obviously is a problem for anyone who can't afford a mobile phone. So the government is providing subsidized telephone and internet services to low-income communities. If you don't qualify for those programs, though, and if your local phone company is no longer in the landline business, then ownership of a mobile phone could be effectively mandatory. Now, you could go the flip phone route if you wanted to remain clear of smartphones, but this does get us right to the edge of mandatory ownership.
In addition to what you just said, Mark, there's also the cost of the smartphone. I pulled a couple of stats just in case you didn't have them. The average cost of a new smartphone is about $363, and the average cell phone plan is $113 a month. So that's a lot of money to add to people who are working poor or worse.
Well, speaking as someone who worked for nearly 10 years in the telecom industry, there are segments of the market that are for people who would struggle with that price, where it's a pay-as-you-go plan. So basically, you top your phone up with minutes, and those can be radically cheaper. You were correct in terms of what you would get if you walked through the doors of a Verizon store, for instance. You'd be looking at a bill upwards of $100 a month. But if you do your homework and check in with something like Cricket Wireless, you can actually get a cheaper plan.
Yeah.
I just sounded like a advertisement for T-Mobile, which I did not intend. But there are lower cost options because you're right. The standard cell plan is too expensive for many Americans.
Right. And I think the demographic of cell phone users probably skews toward more income, right? I'm imagining the sweet spot for smartphone use is still urban, college-educated people who make a lot more money than the median salary.
Sure. Yes, cell phone signal coverage is much better in cities than it is in rural areas. And you're right, smartphone rates go up as you're talking about a demographic that's more educated and better compensated.
Yeah.
So the urban elites that piss off Fox viewers so much, they tend to be smartphone users.
Right.
And then there's a second area where we're steaming towards effectively mandatory smartphone ownership, and that's in the area of identity. Joe, in your original question, you mentioned that one of the reasons you finally broke down and got a smartphone is you needed it for work. Two-factor authentication required use of a smartphone.
Correct.
Two-factor authentication for the uninitiated, and you are lucky if you are uninitiated.
Yes, you sure are.
It's the latest standard in network security. It's an upgrade on passwords. When you try to log into a system under two-factor authentication, it sends a signal to your mobile device, and then you send something back that verifies that it's you. For instance, I have the Google Authenticator app on my phone, and a web service might ask me to send them the number I see in Google Authenticator. That number changes all the time, and it's unique to me, so if I send them the right number, they can be confident that I'm the one sending the number.
Right. And just to be clear, I'm not objecting to two-factor authentication. I'm objecting to the fact that my company makes two-factor authentication only available on a smartphone, not on my landline.
Because they probably think that it's more secure. And smartphones are often a part of this process because for many companies, you need a smartphone to run the security apps. And they're likely to become even more a part of it in the coming upgrade on two-factor authentication, which is biometrics. If you own a smartphone, it's already set up with the tech to verify your identity. Maybe it checks your thumbprint to allow you to open the phone, or in the case of my iPhone, it verifies my face. In the foreseeable future, your phone might perform a retina scan or some other function that's effectively impossible to fake. This is all in the interest of security because businesses have a lot at stake in making sure that only authorized personnel get at their resources. And with so many of us working from home now, they need to enable that access from almost anywhere in the world. The most secure and effective place to do this identity verification is on your phone because you always have it with you, you're comfortable in its use, and it has the processing power to perform all the necessary calculations on the device itself rather than sending the information to some central server, which would provide an opening for hackers to hijack the process. State and federal governments are also interested in jumping on this bandwagon, and there are a number of digital ID measures in the works. 8 U.S. states have already launched digital ID measures, though neither Washington nor New York are among those, just to make this personal for you and me.
Mm-hmm.
And the Department of Homeland Security is working on a national standard. The idea is that you would store your driver's license and passport on your phone and display that info on your screen. In theory, that's more secure since it's much easier to steal or duplicate a driver's license than it is to gain access to and use someone else's phone. Now, it's unlikely that these digital IDs are going to replace your physical ID anytime soon, especially since right-wing groups are already protesting that digital ID is part of a plot by Democrats, communists, and the Illuminati to infringe upon our God-given freedoms.
And let's just stipulate that it is such a plot.
Sure. Fair is fair. George Soros, I'm sure, is in a room right now mapping out the digital ID project.
Of course.
It is very likely, though, that increasing your phone will serve as an extension and proof of your identity even without a national standard. Which brings us at last to the New York Yankees. Joe, you love the Yankees more than life itself. Would you say that's accurate?
That's close to accurate.
It's in the ballpark, so to speak.
Yes. Yes.
And recently, the Yankees shifted over to digital tickets.
Yes.
You can no longer order and print tickets at home. Now you get a ticket in your email, load it on your phone, and show the ticket collector your screen when you get to the gate. Did I capture the process accurately?
Yes, correct. And you can't even scan a ticket and bring that piece of paper to the Yankees. They won't accept anything on paper anymore.
Right. The Yankees said this was in the interest of convenience, to fight fraud, and to protect the environment from all those ticket stubs blowing in the wind. And those things might all be true, but the primary reasons for using digital tickets are probably pretty basic. Businesses, as a rule, love digital tickets. It costs them less. They don't need to print or distribute the tickets, and there's no cleanup after a ticket's been used. They can, if they wish, set limits or even prohibit the ticket owner from transferring it to another user. And digital tickets allow sports teams and music venues to make life difficult for scalpers who have existed for generations as a sort of parasitic worm in the digestive system of the sports, music, and entertainment industries. For organizations like the Yankees, digital tickets are almost all upside. So it's a safe bet that this business practice will only become more common over time, even if it makes life a little bit more difficult for their customers. So how does this fit into our wider discussion today? As much as you love the Yankees, Joe, I don't think even you would say that it's mandatory for you to attend their games. If you could only watch the games on television, life would go on. It's a choice you make. And that's true of a lot of the scenarios we've discussed here. You can choose the non-smartphone path. If, however, existence in this modern world comes to involve such a lengthy series of compromises that you must make if you don't want a smartphone, the cumulative weight of those compromises might become so great that you start to feel like you do, in fact, need to get a phone.
Yes. You just put your finger on it. That's it.
Yeah. I mentioned that the iPhone was introduced 16 years ago, and that now about 15% of Americans remain in the no smartphone camp. This number will be hard to reduce because it's composed of people either who cannot buy a smartphone or who year after year have chosen not to.
Right.
Everyone in that 15% believes they have a very good reason not to own a smartphone. If there's some feature of modern life that is truly necessary, I believe that government will step up with legislation that requires companies to provide non-smartphone options for that remaining 15%, because, again, there are people who are simply poor in that group and do not have the option of making that choice. There will, though, be no requirements to make those alternatives pleasant or convenient. Businesses today assume that their customers own a phone because upwards of 80% of them do, and anyone who does not will be expected to jump through hoops to get at the alternative. And while jumping through those hoops, they'll be aware that this thing they're doing would be a lot quicker and easier if they simply bought a phone. How long do they hold out? How much weight of inconvenience becomes too much? That's a line in the sand that we all draw for ourselves. So will smartphones ever be mandatory? In the literal sense, no. But in the practical sense, it might not matter.
I think that's true, Mark, and I think that's well put, especially the last part about it might not matter, because if it feels like you're being squeezed into it, then it doesn't really matter whether it's technically mandatory, does it? You know?
Yeah, if you have two options and one is full of convenience and one is full of sorrow, then even if you resent the convenient choice, most people are going to choose it because who needs the aggravation? That's how businesses convince you to do things that you don't want to do.
Right.
And it doesn't just apply to things like smartphones. That's been a business tactic for a long time. Take the option that they don't want you to make and make it unpleasant so that you choose the option that they do want you to take.
Right. So let's talk about this for a minute. How many other products in human history have had this trajectory where we get to a point after 15 years? How many other products in the history of human product innovation have become virtually mandatory after some period of time? Can you think of any?
How about the automobile?
Okay, I'm glad you mentioned that.
From a hobbyist item when Henry Ford came out with his first Model T to about 40 years later when basically that's how you navigated a city.
Yeah, so I'm glad you mentioned cars because I thought about this before our taping and I came up with two, cars and television.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to say something about both and get your reaction to this. So for cars, I feel like this is what it boils down to with this product that is admittedly ubiquitous throughout the world. You can choose to live in a place where a car is required to do things like go to work or buy your groceries or take your kids to and from school.
Sure.
But you can also live in a place where cars are not necessary. A place like where I live, where home and school and supermarket are reachable on foot or via mass transit. With smartphones, do we really have a choice to opt out?
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting question. I think that's an example of, yes, you can opt out of a car. There's some inconvenience, but you can manage it and still have a good quality of life. It is more difficult with the smartphone.
Yeah.
But, I mean, consider the landline. Like, how easy would it be for you to opt out of a landline and opt out of the telephone altogether? And that's a product that you still have in your life. That's a product that you have chosen to continue life. So how would it feel if you were to tell friends and family, yeah, I'm just not going to have a phone anymore? That doesn't feel like that's an option either.
Yeah, that's a good point. I had not considered the phone. Your point is well taken, Mark. Just let me talk about television for a minute, though, because I did think about TV and TV ownership. I mean, if we're at 85% cell phone penetration, we've got to be at 98% or better television penetration right now.
Sure. Yeah.
So I think it's fair to argue that for many decades now, like since the middle of the 20th century and into the 21st century, you needed, and I put the word need in quotes, you needed a TV in order to be conversant in pop culture, in order to be a cultural citizen.
Yeah.
So I think the analogy is pretty good with cell phones in that respect.
Oh, yeah.
But you don't need to own a TV to work from home or to attend a baseball game or to read a menu in a restaurant.
Right.
And that's what makes it different than cell phones. And that's what makes the smartphone imperative much more nefarious in my eyes than television. Mm-hmm. What do you think?
I think that's an objective description of the situation. The smartphone is, again, a computer that's in your pocket. There are very few things that you can't do with your phone. And so it ends up doing everything that you want it to do. And so a television, it rules your living room and it contributes heavily to your social life, but it doesn't stray outside of that space. And the smartphone, by definition, is something that you take with you everywhere. And so, yeah, it has a much bigger impact on people's lives.
Yeah, and at some basic level, it just rubs me the wrong way, you know, that there would be this product that I have to buy that costs hundreds of dollars and costs hundreds of thousands of dollars over the course of your life, if you consider your monthly charges for data. And it just seems for that to become a virtually mandatory tool in order to live in the world and be a citizen, you know?
Yeah.
The way I was talking about just with television, like if you didn't know what All in the Family was or Mr. Spock, you know, you were not cool. You were a loser, you know? Mm-hmm. So, well, in this day and age, if you don't know what's going on TikTok and, you know, all these other apps you get on your phone, you're not a citizen of the culture. You're not a fully participating citizen. So for it to all be distilled in this one product that we're forced to buy, that just rubs me the wrong way.
Well, it's interesting that you'd bring up Mr. Spock in the middle of your diatribe there, because I grew up, probably similar to you, a big fan of science fiction. I was reading Golden Age science fiction when I was a teenager. And I was excited at the prospect of space exploration and robots and technology. And the world has not delivered the jetpacks and the individual spaceships that I was promised. And that's a disappointment to me. But of the things that are in my life that seem like they line up pretty well with science fiction, my phone is pretty damn close to the things that we saw people using in Star Trek that Spock would hold in his hand as he beamed down to the planet.
Yeah.
And so it's funny that you and I started out with a shared enthusiasm for Star Trek. And then I embrace these things as a portal to knowledge, essentially, which I use my phone mostly to consume information rather than to connect with people. And for me, that's kind of fulfilling of a childhood wish to live in that science world. But for you, it just doesn't connect. And that's fine. I'm not saying you're wrong.
Yeah.
I just think it's interesting that we diverge like that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point you make. Thought-provoking. I was really referring to Spock as a cultural touchstone, though, not so much about the technology of Star Trek and how it parallels what's happening today. I could have said Janet Jackson's wardrobe malfunction in the Super Bowl halftime show, which people watched on television.
Yeah.
And you only knew that happened if you watched it on television. You know, TV was the window into the culture then, and now it's the phone. And we have no choice in the matter, it seems to me. That's what bugs me.
It's a very powerful force in our world, and it is probably not going away. And yeah, I can see where if that's not what you want, then you would feel like it is being forced down your throat, and that would be unpleasant.
Yeah.
I love my iPhone, so I'm always excited about new developments there, but that's just my enthusiasms. I don't believe that they're better than other people's.
Right. So, well, thank you for the answer. I do think you're right. You've given me the right answer. It just doesn't cheer me very much, but I didn't expect coming in that I would be cheered by this subject. So, yeah.
So are you ready for your question for next time?
Yes.
Okay. Usually for my questions, I try to think of something that I look forward to discussing. In this case, I'm pretty sure your answer will give me a bit of a headache, but still, this feels like the one to ask.
Okay.
Every couple of years in this country, our elected representatives play a game of chicken. There's a big, important deadline that cannot be missed, and everyone is wondering whether our lawmakers will come to the table and negotiate in good faith to avoid missing it. Breathless headlines are written about how bad it will be if this deadline is missed. So far, as a nation, we have not missed this deadline, but since we keep playing that game of chicken over and over again, it does seem that sooner or later the process will break down somehow and the deadline will be missed. I'm talking, of course, about the debt ceiling.
Yep.
President Biden and House Majority Leader McCarthy reached an agreement to lift the debt ceiling for another 2 years. The agreement has now passed the House and the Senate, so it seems like we won't be suffering the dire consequences of defaulting on the national debt this time. It does pose the question, though, what will happen if and when we do? That's my question, Joe. What will happen to ordinary Americans if our country ever fails to lift the debt ceiling and defaults on its debt? Are we talking Armageddon-level disaster? Will it create an economic crisis that makes the Great Depression look like a mild economic downturn? Will dogs and cats start getting married and living together in unholy union? Usually with worst-case scenarios, you can be confident that they'll never actually happen, but in this case, it actually seems like a real possibility. So tell me what we all might have to look forward to.
Wow, good question. I thought you were going somewhere different with that initially. I thought you were going to ask how we can stave off future debt ceiling crises. But you want me to consider the disaster scenario where it happens. So yeah, that's a really interesting question, Mark. I'll look forward to researching that.
Yeah. I always hear that it's going to be awful if that happens, but no one ever says how specifically awful it's going to be.
Yeah.
So I'd like to know the specifics.
Okay. And I will get them to you. Okay. I'm not sure you were aware of this, but this episode is the 70th episode of our podcast. Did you know that, Mark?
I did not, but that's a nice round number. Hooray for us.
Yeah. And for those of you out there who also didn't know this, you can find our podcast pretty much wherever you listen to podcasts. And I mean almost anywhere. Apple, Google, Amazon, Spotify, our home site, which is Buzzsprout, and many others. If you haven't listened in a while, check out our growing library of content. We've covered a lot of interesting topics in our 3 years on the air, and I would encourage you to find a topic that interests you and listen to that one. No need to binge everything unless you're a true believer.
Yeah, I'm not going to say don't binge. If you want to binge, binge away. We love bingers, but you don't feel like you need to.
Pick and choose by topic, because we do pick interesting, newsworthy topics, just like the one Mark gave me a few seconds ago. If you want to engage with us, there are two options. You can go to our Facebook page, Mansplaining the Podcast, where you can like us, check our sources, leave a comment or question, or give us a 5-star rating if you like what you heard. You can also call us at our special new phone number, 206-486-4074, and leave us a voicemail message with your question or comment. We'd love to entertain potential future topic questions for this podcast, and that's a place where you can leave one. And to the guy who keeps leaving us messages on that line trying to sell us Viagra, let me be perfectly clear. We don't need it.
We're only almost too manly over here, so back off.
You can't see us, folks, but if you did, you'd know what I'm talking about.
They still wouldn't be able to see us because we would be obscured.
Okay, enough of this self-promotion. It's time for us to go. That was Mark. I'm Joe. We'll talk to you next time.
See you then. That's it for this edition of Mansplaining. Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we'll see you next time.